On a quiet autumn morning, the world saw something it had never seen before. King Charles, the man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of restraint, broke down in tears. There was no speech, no royal poise, only raw emotion spilling into the open. For decades, he had worn the crown of composure, but at 75, his walls finally crumbled under the weight of a truth too heavy to hide. What could drive a man raised to silence his emotions to weep before the world? What secret could pierce through generations of royal discipline? The answer came not from enemies or scandals, but from his own brother, Prince Edward. A revelation that would rip open the palace walls and expose the pain that had long been buried with Diana's memory. Charles had always been seen as a figure of endurance, the stoic monarch who carried the burden of history on his shoulders. Yet behind that regal posture was a man worn down by decades of duty, family turmoil, and unspoken regrets. His face, once defined by control, now carried traces of deep sorrow, each line a story of love, loss, and obligation. For years, he had convinced himself that silence was dignity, that emotion was weakness. But Edward's confession shattered that illusion, forcing him to confront the ghosts of a past he had long tried to forget. Edward had always been the quiet one, the brother who stayed out of headlines and controversies. But his quietness hid a secret, a connection with Diana that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. Long after the lights went out in the palace, Diana would call him in tears, her voice trembling as she spoke of the loneliness that consumed her. She told him about the walls that closed in around her, the endless scrutiny, and the fear that she was disappearing behind the royal image. To Edward, she was not a princess, but a woman lost in a world that refused to see her pain. Those late-night calls haunted him. He remembered her whispers, her laughter fading into silence, and the way she always said thank you as if he was the only one who listened. Edward carried her words like a secret vow, one he could neither share nor forget. For years, he remained loyal to his brother, convincing himself that silence was the right thing to do. But as time passed, that silence became unbearable. He began to question whether loyalty to the crown should outweigh loyalty to the truth. His decision to finally speak came with a heavy heart. It wasn't a moment of rebellion or revenge, it was the release of years of guilt. Edward revealed that Diana had confided in him about her darkest moments, her sense of entrapment, and her fear that her story would be erased. He described her desperation not as scandal, but as sorrow, a cry for compassion that went unanswered. His revelation was both confession and tribute, a way to honor her truth after years of it being buried under royal decorum. When the news reached Charles, witnesses say he looked like a man reliving 1,000 unspoken memories. He had spent a lifetime protecting the image of the monarchy, believing that personal sacrifice was the cost of leadership. But Edward's words forced him to face what he had long refused to see, that silence had not protected the family, it had destroyed it. Charles's public tears became a symbol of something deeper than sorrow. They were the acknowledgement of a man who finally understood the cost of his own restraint. Diana's suffering was not just emotional, it was institutional. Edward's testimony painted a grim picture of palace life as a place ruled by control, where appearances mattered more than hearts. Displays of vulnerability were seen as threats, emotions as inconveniences. Within those walls, even love was political. Diana's openness, her compassion, and her humanity clashed with a system that valued perfection over truth. Edward described how courtiers whispered behind closed doors, strategizing not about how to help her, but how to contain her. Edward admitted that he, too, was complicit in that silence. He spoke of the times he wanted to intervene but didn't, of moments when he urged Charles to listen to Diana, only to be dismissed as naive. He recalled one painful conversation where he told his brother that Diana wasn't being dramatic, she was drowning. But Charles, shaped by a lifetime of emotional restraint, brushed it off as exaggeration. That moment, Edward confessed, never stopped haunting him. It was then he realized the price of silence, Diana's voice, her truth, and perhaps her very spirit. When Edward finally shared his story, it sent shockwaves across the world. Newspapers printed his every word, television anchors spoke with trembling voices, and social media erupted with grief and outrage. Some saw Edward as a hero, a man brave enough to break the code of silence. Others called him a traitor, accusing him of tarnishing the crown. But no one could deny that his words reignited Diana's legacy, reminding the world of the woman behind the title. A mother, a friend, a soul seeking freedom. Inside the royal family, Edward's revelation sparked emotional chaos. William and Harry, already carrying the scars of their mother's death, were thrust into the storm once more. William, ever composed, struggled to balance his love for his family with his duty to protect the monarchy's image. He was angry at the system that had silenced his mother and at the media that never let her rest. Harry, on the other hand, reacted with unfiltered emotion. He spoke passionately about how the same patterns of secrecy and control had followed him and his wife. For both brothers, Edward's truth reopened wounds that never truly healed. The world watched as old footage of Diana flooded the internet, her smile, her compassion, her voice trembling in interviews where she hinted at her pain. Crowds gathered outside royal palaces with flowers and handwritten letters, just as they had decades ago. Once again, Diana's memory united millions, but this time it came with a question that lingered in the air: how much truth had been hidden all along? For Charles, the consequences were devastating. His reign, already marked by quiet controversy, now stood at a crossroads. He faced not just public scrutiny, but personal reckoning. Edward's words had peeled away the crown's protective layers, leaving the man beneath exposed. Charles was seen alone in quiet moments, reflecting on his past with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the entire monarchy. He mourned not only the loss of Diana but also the loss of time, the years he could have spent listening, understanding, and perhaps saving her. As the storm of public opinion grew, palace officials scrambled to contain the crisis. Official statements spoke of unity, compassion, and understanding, but the silence of the king spoke louder. There were whispers of tension within the walls, of advisers questioning whether the monarchy could withstand another blow. The image of Charles weeping had already become a defining symbol of his reign, a moment where humanity overpowered protocol. Edward's confession, however, was not just about grief. It was a reflection of an institution forced to confront its humanity. For centuries, the monarchy had been built on control and secrecy, its power rooted in mystique. But the world had changed. People no longer wanted perfection, they wanted truth. And Edward's courage forced the palace to look in the mirror and see what it had tried to hide for generations, that even kings can be broken by silence. In one particularly emotional recollection, Edward described the night Diana told him she feared being forgotten. She said she felt like a ghost in her own life, visible to the world but unseen by those closest to her. Those words, Edward said, never left him. They were the reason he finally decided to speak. He couldn't bear the thought of her being reduced to just a memory or a headline. His revelation was his way of keeping her spirit alive, of ensuring the world remembered the woman behind the crown. As time passed, public sympathy began to shift. Many saw Charles not just as a monarch but as a man paying the price for the mistakes of an entire system. His tears were seen as a long overdue acknowledgement of everything Diana endured. For some, it was redemption. For others, too little too late. But regardless of opinion, the world finally saw the royal family not as an untouchable institution, but as human beings entangled in love, guilt, and legacy. Edward's words didn't just break silence, they changed everything. The monarchy could no longer rely on distance or mystery. Its future would depend on honesty, empathy, and the courage to confront the truth. And in that sense, Edward's act of vulnerability became the spark for something larger, a quiet revolution within the palace walls. In the end, the story isn't only about betrayal or confession. It's about the power of truth, even when spoken too late. It's about a king who wept not because he was weak, but because he finally allowed himself to feel. It's about a brother who carried guilt for too long and a woman whose light refused to fade, even after death. Diana's memory, once confined to history, now glows brighter than ever, reminding the world that empathy is more powerful than silence. And as King Charles stands beneath the weight of his crown, his tears mark not the end of strength but the beginning of understanding. The monarchy may never be the same again, and perhaps that's exactly what Diana hoped for, a world where truth has a voice, even within the walls of power. If you were moved by this story and believe her legacy deserves to be remembered, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that reveal the hearts behind the headlines.